It's Bible Club, it's Bible Club, it's Bible Club in our town. There's singing, there's laughing, let's get the word on the ground. We're all excited, and we are all delighted. It's Bible Club, Bible Club, Bible Club, Bible Club, Bible Club in our town. All right, so there's a lot of you that were here last week. Some of you were not, so if you weren't here, you can try to listen. Or you can try to answer, but for sure listen so that you hear the answers to our review questions because they have something to do with today's lesson. First, we did a quick review last week of the books of the Bible, starting with Genesis, and we got ourselves all the way to Ezra. So let's see if we can say them together. Say the ones you know. If you don't know, just keep your mouth quiet and jump back in when you know them. Here we go. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra. And then there's some more. We'll get to them. We'll get to the next one next week. Actually, last week we didn't even talk about Ezra. Who remembers the big long name starts with a Z that we talked about last week? The man who led the people of Israel back to Jerusalem. Does anybody remember his name? It starts with a Z. Can you imagine having a name that starts with a Z? Does anybody have a name that starts with a Z? You have a friend? What's his name? Zachary, okay. Zachary, that's short for Zachariah, probably. Yeah. But does anybody remember this guy's name? It's even funnier than Zachary. I mean, I don't know. He probably didn't think it was a funny name. Maybe all of his friends made fun of him when he was growing up. We have an Isaiah, but that's no Z. Yeah. Anybody know? His name was Zerubbabel. Remember, isn't that kind of a funny Zerubbabel? Yeah, bubbles and all that kind of stuff. Zerubbabel. Now, okay, so, and I said, God used Zerubbabel to bring the children of Israel back to Jerusalem, right? So, at the beginning of our lesson, we talked about a certain word that our lessons are about. Does anybody remember what that word is? That our lesson last week, and we're going to be reminded of it this week and next week and the next week, what our lessons are about. Chloe, do you remember? Do you remember what the word is? Anybody remember what that word is that our lessons are going to be about? God is... The smart kids know what's going on. What is the word? You don't know how to say that word, do you? Cody? Sovereign? That's spelling it out. Sovereign. That's right. That's right. And we had a little phrase, and I'm going to pull it up here to remember. What does that word sovereign mean? Remember this? Let's say it all together. God is always in complete control of everything, everywhere. Wow. Who is so smart to be able to be in complete control of everything, everywhere? Who? God. Who has enough strength and power to be completely in control of everything, everywhere? God. That's right. So, and no one else even comes close. You know, some people think they're really powerful, but they can control certain things, but they can only control something in a little place, and they can't control everything. So nobody even comes close to God. God is, with me, always in complete control of everything, everywhere. And last week we realized how God was in control of King Cyrus. Remember? Does anybody remember what King Cyrus did? Cody? Yeah, he told the Israelites to
Yeah, now who was King Cyrus? Was he the king of the Israelites? No. He was, do you remember who he was the king of? Not the Assyrians. He was the king of the Persians. But he was not the king of, he had defeated the Babylonians who had taken all the Israelites captive, and lots of Jewish people were living over in Babylon. Why were they living in Babylon and not in Jerusalem? Now this would not be just from last week. Why were the children of Israel not living in their homeland? They were living in Babylon. Or we should say this, I'm going to tell you, they were captured. Why were they captured? Why did God let the children of Israel be captured, made slaves, made to move all halfway around the world, it felt like? Why? Ian. They worshipped idols. That's right. And do you remember one of the ways that they started worshiping idols? This might not be as easy. Cody, do you remember one of the ways that they started worshiping idols? That was one of the things they did when they worshiped. Some of the idols wanted them to sacrifice their own children, and they did. But how did they start worshiping idols when they had God, who is the greatest God, the only real God? How did they start worshiping idols? There's different ways it might have started. I'm going to come to you, but let's see what Allie says.
A bad king or queen.
A bad king or queen. So a bad king or queen would say, we can worship other gods too. And one of those bad kings was Ahab and his wife Jezebel. That's right. Is that what you were going to say? What were you going to say, Ian? Kings would marry the princesses or women who were not believers in God. And let me tell you, it wasn't just kings. The children of Israel. Sometimes they would let their daughters marry a heathen, idol-worshipping young man. And sometimes they would let their sons go and find a heathen and fall in love with a heathen, idol-worshipping girl, and they would get married. They might think, oh, they'll start to worship God. But you know what also happened? They started worshiping the fake idol gods, didn't they? And doing the evil things that the idol worshippers did. And so God punished Israel, and he let the Assyrians took Israel, and the Babylonians took the people of Judah and carried them all the way to Babylon, and they lived there. Now I said this number last week. Do you remember how long God said they had to be in captivity? Ian remembers. Cody is right there. Ian thinks he remembers. Does anyone else remember? Kaylee is staring down. She does not remember this number. Chloe, do you remember? You were here last week. Cody? How many? 7? 70. Yes, it was 70. 70 years that they were in captivity. And then the king of Persia said, I want to build a temple. And I want people who are Israelites that want to go back. And Zerubbabel led them. God did a certain thing in some people's hearts. You remember what he did? Did all the Israelites go back to Jerusalem? No. Only the ones that God stirred up their hearts. And other ones stayed back, and some of them, what did they do? If they didn't go, remember what they did? They didn't die. No, they lived fine. Ian is already going to say it, so I'm going to say it. They gave money, right? They gave silver and gold and animal sacrifice. They gave money to help their countrymen in their journey. So they got back, and they had some trouble, but finally, they got the temple built in about 22 years. They finally finished it in 22 years. Well, things were going okay. About 10 years later, things were going okay. 20 years later, 30 years later, and pretty soon, the children of Israel were there, and they kind of even forgot why God had let their parents be taken captive and their grandparents be taken captive. They forgot. They were not very devout. they were not very careful. And I can imagine, I don't know this, but I know the end result of this from the Bible. So I imagine something like this happened one day. One of the Jewish boys came home to his dad and said, "Hey, Dad, one of my friends is having a party at his house. Could I go over to his house and have fun with their family?" And Dad thought, "Oh, that family, those people are not Israelites. They're idol worshippers. They're heathen. They don't believe in God." And he probably said something like, "Well, I don't think you should go over to their house. They don't believe in the one true God like we do." And what do you think his son said? "Ah, Dad, but he's such a nice guy. I won't worship idols over there. I just want to go over there and have fun. Besides, the priest, he's going to be over there." Uh-oh. So the priest was going to the heathen people's house for their party. And so Dad said, "Well, I don't know. I guess if the priest is going over there, it can't be that bad." And so he let his son go over there to a party at his friend's house. And they had a good time. They had a lot of fun. But, you know, a lot of times the celebrations that the heathen had, they celebrated because they were celebrating something with their fake idol gods. And so the son learned about his friend's gods, fake gods, idol gods. And he went to another party, and he went to another party, and before long, the boy came home and said, "Hey, Dad, I really like my friend's sister. I think I would like to marry her someday." Now, is there a problem with that? What's the problem with that? You said yes. What's the problem with that? That's right. The girl was an idol worshiper, and the boy was supposed to be a follower of God. Right? But by then, it was too late. The boy's heart was already sold on liking and marrying that girl. And he said, "Well, I will get her to worship God." Do you think that happened? Well, maybe she went to the temple once or twice, but probably not. And you know what did happen? That boy, he married her, and then what did he start doing? Celebrating the idol festivals. And what did their children do? They worshiped idols. And when you turn from God, there's a word for that. There's a word for turning from God, and it's in our verse. Forsaking Him. Yeah. Forsaking God. When you turn from God. And what does the Bible say about those that forsake Him? God's power and wrath is against them, right? Yeah. It's not good, is it? It doesn't look good. The people of Israel got taken into captivity because they worshipped idols. Now they're back, and some of them are already, 20, 30 years later, worshiping idols again. Now, I want to tell you about somebody else. We have to remember that. Back in Persia, there was a young man, and he came from a priestly family. His dad was a priest, and his grandfather was a priest. So when he got to be older, he was going to be a priest, right? Now, he didn't have a temple to worship in, did he, back here? But his parents were godly, and they taught him about the Bible. And soon in his life, he determined in his heart that he wanted to learn the Bible and understand it and learn it good enough to be able to teach other people the Bible. And his name was Ezra. His name was Ezra. Way easier than Zerubbabel. But Ezra was a young man, and he got it in his, and so he did. He learned the Bible. He set his heart to do that. When other kids were doing other things, he got around the scriptures and studied them and learned them. He made it his goal to learn the Bible so he could help other people learn the Bible. Now, what do you guys want to do with your life? That learning the Bible to tell other people about it, that's a good thing to do, isn't it? So, we should think about what we want to do. Some of you guys are really young. You just want to go to school and come home and have fun. But when you get older, like Cody and Ian, they're really old. They're really old. I mean, I'm not that old, but they are really old.
Then they get some teacher.
Yeah. So we get older, we start thinking about what we're going to do with our life, like Ezra. And Ezra determined that he wanted to serve God with his life, and he wanted to serve God by learning the Bible and teaching it to others. And God, who put that in Ezra's heart? God did, didn't he? But Ezra followed God's leading in his heart, and he started learning the Bible, and then God gave Ezra a desire. He wanted himself. He wanted to go back to Jerusalem and teach the people back there the Bible. Now, could Ezra, he lived over here in Persia, could he just go wherever he wanted to go, whenever he wanted to go? No. Why? Because he's not a free man. I mean, he's kind of free from day to day, but if he wants to move over there, who has to give him permission to move out of his area to this area? Who has to give him permission? Who on the earth has to give him permission? The king. Because doesn't have chains on, but he can't just do whatever he wants. He's living in Persia. Who's in charge in Persia? The king of Persia. And he says who can go where and who can't go where. And Ezra wanted to go, but the king had to give him permission. Somehow Ezra asked the king for permission. And what do you think the king said?
No.
You think the king said no? He could have said no. But God wanted Ezra to go to Jerusalem. And so what did God do?
Say yes.
He changed or set it in the heart of the king to say yes. Who could change a king's mind? God. Why? Because God is always, right, in complete control of everything, everywhere. And God put it in the heart of King Artaxerxes. Now that's a name, huh? To say yes. In fact, we will give you money, and I want you to see what other Jewish people want to go back. Now, does anybody remember how many people went back with Zerubbabel last week? I mean, it was 30 years ago now, but it was last week for us. You remember how many went back? How many thousands went back? It was 50,000. Over 50,000 went back with Zerubbabel. Ezra went around and said, the king has given us permission for some of us to go back to Jerusalem. How many want to come? He's given us money to help us on our way, to pay for our way and get us there. And how many want to come? And Ezra got over 6,000. Way less, but over 6,000 people. Now, that's a big group of people. And Ezra got 6,000 people to go. And they went, and they all gathered, and they were about to set out. And Ezra said, here's what we need to do. We need to pray and fast. And we need to ask God to protect us. Because we have all this money from the king with us, and we've got a long trip to go on. And there could be robbers along the way. There could be hardship along the way. And we need to ask God to protect us. And somebody said, well, is the king going to send his soldiers along with us to protect us? And Ezra said, no. I told the king we don't need the soldiers' help. I told the king that the hand, and this is, who said this? Ezra. Ezra said, I told the king that the hand of our God is upon all them for good that seek him. That's Ezra's words. That's in our lesson today. Ezra said, we don't need soldiers to help us if God is helping us. Now, isn't that true? If God is helping us, do we need soldiers to help us? Now, sometimes God uses soldiers, but if God is helping us, we don't need soldiers because God is always in complete control, right, of everything, everywhere. And so they prayed and they asked God to protect them as they traveled, and then they went on their way. And as they got going along their way, they made it there safely. God protected them. And when they got there, they counted out all the silver and gold that they had, and they had all this. No, they had not lost any along the way. Now, Ezra was a godly man, right? And he had set his heart to learn the Bible and teach the Bible to his countrymen, right? Which is a good thing. But what did Ezra find when he got to Israel? Did he find people following God? No. What had the people of Israel started to do? They were worshiping idols, remember? And why were they worshiping idols? How did they start worshiping idols? They were married to people that were not believers, right? They married unbelievers, and the unbelievers got them to worship their idols. When Ezra saw that, he was heartbroken. He went to the temple, which was still there. He went to the temple, and he fell down before God and said, "Oh, God, I am so embarrassed, and I am ashamed, because all of us, our fathers and our grandfathers, we forsook you, and we worshiped idols, and you punished us, and you took us away from our land and sent us to Babylon, and we've lived there for many years, and then you have allowed us to come back to our homeland, and we have forsaken you again." He was full of sorrow, and he repented. Even though he hadn't done those sins, he repented for his countrymen. And people noticed that he was so full of sorrow. And after a while, some of the men, they started to realize what they had done wrong. And they realized that that was sin. And they came to Ezra and they said, "Ezra, we have sinned, because we have married people who are not believers. What should we do?" Now I want you to listen to this. I'm almost done, but I want you to listen to this. I'm going to back up just a little bit. How many of you have ever thrown a little rock into water? And it has that little ring right around it, right? But then the rings go out, and they go out further and further. That little rock just went in there, but the rings went out further and further and further until it disappears, but it spreads out, doesn't it? And what looked like just a little thing went a long way out. And when we sin, lots of times we think in our head it's just a little thing. When the children of Israel thought, "I'd like to marry that girl who's not a believer," they probably thought, "Well, it's just me. What? It's not that big of a deal," right? But listen, in the Old Testament, this is what God said they had to do. God said that all those men who were married to heathen women had to leave their wives. They had to send their wives back to their heathen lands. And you know what happened then? Moms had to take their kids away from their dads. You think it was a happy day? It was not a happy day. And why did that happen? Because of a sin a long time back. God punishes sin. His wrath and his power is against those that forsake him. He loved the Israelites, but he had to punish them for their sin. And these men who thought they were doing something that would just affect them, who did it affect later on? Their own children. That was very sad. But it was much more important to please God than to not have sadness in their hearts. Now in the New Testament, the Bible tells us a different way to take care of that problem. But the example is still to us that what we do today has an effect down the road. It affects more people than what we think. And it's still true today that those that believe in God, those that are believers, should not marry unbelievers. You should not marry unbelievers. And listen to this. All of you, listen to this. If you say, well, I like that person, and you know what I mean by that. I like that person. If you're a believer, you should not like somebody that's not a believer. It shouldn't matter that they have a nice personality, that they're fun to be around with. You can be around them and you can witness to them. You can give them a tract that tells them about God. You can read the Bible with them. You can be friendly to them, but you can't like them, not like that, because they don't believe in God. God doesn't want believers to marry unbelievers. Some of you girls, some boy is going to be a nice guy. He's going to be fun and cool to be around with. But if he doesn't believe in God, you keep him away. Keep him like this far away, like at arm's length. Don't let him do nice things to you to try to win your heart. Your heart belongs to God. Your heart belongs to Jesus. And we have to be careful. It was 3,000 years ago, these guys, what happened? They hung out with them, and then they started liking them, and then they married them. And God was upset with that. And it happens the same way today. So I know some of you younger are like, why is Pastor Hogan saying that? Because look around, there's some older kids here, and we need to know that. We need to be reminded who God wants us to marry. The Bible says in the New Testament that believers can marry kind of whoever they want as long as they are other believers. And we should remember that. So specifically, you older ones, listen to that. All of us need to remember that when we sin, there's stuff down the road that happens. And so we should never want to sin. Because we are humans, we sin. But we should repent. We should ask for God's forgiveness. We should ask for God, the Holy Spirit, to help us not to do it again, so that we can please the Lord and not hurt others and ourselves down the road.